The life of the Buddha was almost contemporaneous with that of Confucius, but they lived worlds apart. Siddhartha Gautama, the given name of the man who later earned the title the Buddha, was born in ancient India just before the death of Confucius. Although they were vastly different, India and China, 2,500 years ago, shared at least one thing. Both were age-old cultures in the midst of great changes. But the Buddha's India was not disrupted by the kind of political turbulence that beleaguered ancient China. In fact, India was enjoying a period of remarkable political stability. But it was experiencing another kind of ferment, a profound transformation in thought. By the time Siddhartha Gautama was born, a slow but certain conceptual shift had been underway in India for several centuries. Just as the political situation in ancient China had prompted an outpouring of creative intellectual responses, the evolution of the Indian worldview, likewise, inspired a movement of impressive philosophical and spiritual innovation. Siddhartha Gautama was one of many individuals who grappled with this transition that redefined the way Indians thought of themselves, their gods, and their world. To set the Buddha's thought and practice in historical context, we'll spend this lecture investigating the nature of these changes and the new problems they summoned forth. Beginning with the earliest known inhabitants of the Indian subcontinent, we will trace the major cultural developments in this region up to the time of the Buddha, the middle of the first millennium BCE. We'll pay special attention to the deepening anxiety about death and the transient nature of the world, and on the mounting hopes for overcoming these fears. This outline will be the background for our later discussion of the Buddha. It will also serve as a primer on classical Hinduism, for the Buddha's life and teachings emerge out of the same context that gave the Hindu tradition its distinctive character. Long before the birth of Siddhartha Gautama, India had been the home of a great civilization that was every bit as sophisticated as the culture that existed at the same time along the banks of the Yellow River. By 3000 BCE, or perhaps even earlier, a remarkable society had begun to develop along the valley flanking the Indus River in the area now occupied by northwestern India and Pakistan. We know little about this civilization apart from the archaeological remains that have been unearthed in the last 150 years. Its language has never been deciphered, so we have no idea what its inhabitants called themselves. Today, it's simply known as the Indus Valley Civilization, or the Harappan culture, after one of its major cities. The archaeological artifacts from the Indus Valley Civilization indicate that its citizens lived a relatively peaceful life based on an agricultural economy and some trade, and that they prized order and stability. Their religious practices focused on rituals for ensuring the continuance of life on earth, much like the religion of the Shang dynasty in China. By 1500 BCE, however, this splendid civilization had nearly come to an end, and a new people had begun to dominate the region. These newcomers were the Aryans, who had started to migrate into the area from Central Asia by way of Iran. The Aryans brought with them a decisively different religious and cultural outlook than the Indus Valley inhabitants. They worshiped different gods, practiced different rituals, and lived a semi-nomadic existence based on a pastoral economy. They also brought a vast oral tradition they called the Vedas, born by their native language, Sanskrit. And they brought a stratified social arrangement known as the Varna system. Both the Vedas and the Varna system became immensely important in the development of the Hindu tradition. The Vedas, which the Aryans regarded as revealed sacred knowledge, eventually became the highest scriptural authority for Hinduism. Varna became the basis of the caste system. Varna was the Aryans' name for the social classes, of which there were four. The highest Varna was the Brahmins, who were the priests and educators. Next was the Varna of warriors and nobility, followed by that of the merchants and artisans. The lowest Varna was the farmers and the manual laborers. Although the Buddha was a descendant of these Aryan migrants, he came to reject the validity of both the Varna system and the Vedas. By the time of the Buddha, the Aryans had occupied northern India for around 1,000 years. They'd begun to expand into northeastern India, into the region known as the Gangetic Plain, the area surrounding the Ganges River and its tributaries. This was the area in which Gautama was born and spent his entire life. As they expanded eastward, the Aryans became more sedentary, establishing villages and towns and taking up farming and trade in addition to their traditional pursuits as pastoralists. With urbanization and a new economy, the Aryans began to enjoy material wealth as never before. At least a dozen small states governed by the warrior caste began to arise throughout the region. As Aryan society evolved, traditional religious practices and beliefs, especially the rituals that had been the exclusive domain of the Brahmins, came under question. Accordingly, the power and prestige of the priests diminished somewhat, abetted by the rise of the middle Varnas, particularly the warriors and merchants. This growing dissatisfaction with traditional religion, as well as an increasing restlessness among those with a philosophical bent of mind, was driven by several new ideas that were gaining acceptance throughout the Gangetic Plain. The new thoughts that disrupted Indian religion began to surface around 800 BCE, some 300 years before the birth of Siddhartha Gautama. Near this time, small coteries of intellectuals in northeastern India began to think seriously about death and its aftermath in response to increasing anxiety about the ultimate human destiny. To appreciate the importance of this emerging concern, we have to recognize that the Aryans and their Indus Valley predecessors were not especially troubled by death. To these more ancient inhabitants of India, death was more or less accepted as a fact of life. A sad event, to be sure, but nothing warranting great fear or terror. Religious practices were intended to help secure the goods of the world that could make life here and now more comfortable and more pleasurable. Not a whole lot of attention was given to what might lie beyond the cremation pyre. But that attitude began to change in the centuries just before the Buddha. Death was now a subject exercising some of the brightest minds of the age. The anxiety about death was prompted by the emerging sense of the self as an individual. In a fascinating tale from the Upanishads, the great collection of philosophical reflection from this era, a young Brahman finds himself sent to the underworld where he confronts Yama, the god of death. And there, in death's own home, the young priest, whose name was Nachiketas, boldly presses Yama to divulge the secrets of life after death. When Yama offered him a long life with many descendants and great wealth instead, Nachiketas refused, declaring that with death looming over existence, the pleasures of the world were ultimately meaningless. What the story revealed was the new intensity with which questions about death were being discussed among thoughtful Aryans. And along with the questions, there was, of course, no shortage of answers. Gradually, one view began to dominate all others, and over several centuries, gained wide acceptance among the Indian populace. The consensus view was that the individual's death would be followed by another birth, and then another life and death, and another birth, and so on. In what came to be called Hinduism, this process was called transmigration of the soul, because it was conceptualized as a spiritual entity traveling from one body to another. This was a novel idea. The ancient Vedas of the Aryans had suggested nothing like this. Conjectures about how and why this series of deaths and births occurred varied widely. But over time, virtually everyone accepted that it did occur and that it was a highly undesirable situation. This apparently vicious cycle was called samsara, a word that meant meandering, suggesting that the whole process was aimless and without meaning. The idea of rebirth was yoked with another conception that made samsara a unique idea in the history of world religions, the concept of karma. The doctrine of karma ethicized the Indian view of rebirth. In our discussion of Confucius, we observed that he ethicized the ancient practice of ritual by imbuing it with a moral significance. In a similar way, the idea of karma added a moral dimension to the process of rebirth. Karma was an ancient Aryan term that originally referred to the mechanism by which rituals were understood to operate. It later came to mean action in a more generic sense. In its fundamental meaning, karma was an act, and that included any thought or word as well as a deed. But even more, karma referred to the consequences of the act. Hence, one might have said that a particular action generated or produced karma. Karmic acts, furthermore, could be either good or bad. In classical Hinduism, the quality of any karmic act was determined by whether or not it conformed to dharma, the duties incumbent on persons according to their caste and gender. Like karma, dharma is probably a term many of you are familiar with already. As we proceed with these lectures, you will hear slight variations in the way I pronounce these and other words. For example, you may hear me say dharma, and then in another context I will say dhamma. That difference is deliberate. Dharma is a Sanskrit term. Dhamma is a word from Pali, a language closely related to Sanskrit. I will use Sanskrit terms when I'm discussing a Hindu concept, because Sanskrit is the classical language of Hinduism. I will use Pali for Buddhist terms because Pali is the language of the earliest Buddhist writings. It is helpful to use these different languages because the words have different meanings in their respective contexts. Dharma and Dhamma mean truth in both Hinduism and Buddhism, but they carry significantly different senses of what constitutes truth. You'll hear slight differences in other words, such as Siddhartha, rather than the better-known Sanskrit name Siddhartha, or Sutta rather than Sutra, Bodhisattva rather than Bodhisattva. Now, let's return to our analysis of Dharma. As I was saying, Dharma means truth in Hinduism, but also one's duty according to caste and gender. In this respect, Dharma differs from Buddhism, which did not acknowledge caste and gender differences in its conception of truth. Hinduism did not embrace a universal ethic for all people at all times, but thought that moral obligations were different for different kinds of people at different times. It was the moral responsibility of members of the warrior caste to protect and defend their country, and it was the moral duty of priests to sacrifice on behalf of others. Fulfilling one's dharma was the way to produce positive karma. Neglecting or violating dharma resulted in negative karma. The Buddha accepted the principle of karma, but he rejected the idea that its moral quality was contingent on one's caste and gender duties. The Buddha, however, did agree with the classical Hindu view on one very important point, that the consequences of karmic acts eventually return to the agent. Simply stated, the one who acts will reap the good consequences of a good action and the negative consequences of a negative action. The return or ripening of karma might not happen immediately. It might take a very long time for the consequences of an action to come back to the agent, but its return was inevitable. The good or bad events that occurred could be regarded as the result of the individual's actions performed in the past. One's so-called good or bad luck was not luck at all, but simply the ripening of past karmas. The doctrine of karma meant that the events of one's life were not predetermined by fate or a god. For better or worse, human beings determined their own destinies. As the novelist George Eliot put it, our deeds still travel with us from afar, and what we have been makes us what we are. The doctrine of karma significantly altered the conception of rebirth. Since it is not evident that one always reaps the consequences of one's actions in this life, after all, the wicked often prosper, while the good often suffer. Ancient Indian thought extended the possibilities for karma's return into future lives. One's karma could come to fruition at rebirth and in the next life. Thus, the performance of good karmic acts conditioned a favorable rebirth. Evil karmic acts, by the same token, led to an unfavorable rebirth. Obviously, the expressions favorable and unfavorable imply a standard for making these value judgments. A favorable rebirth was one that raised one's place on the hierarchy of being. An unfavorable rebirth lowered one's status. This hierarchy of being ranged from the divine realm of the gods to the human stratum with its own ranking system based on caste, down to the animal, plant, and mineral levels. Potentially, one might be reborn at any place on this hierarchy, but always it was self-generated karma that governed the process and dictated where one was reborn. When the idea of rebirth acquired its ethical dimension, a new outlook on life began to color the Indians' view of the world. From the samsaric perspective, existence now had but one valid objective: to achieve freedom from the endless cycle of death and rebirth. The world of samsara and its pleasures and satisfactions, to be sure, were valuable. But in the long run, from the perspective of an eternal parade of lives and deaths, the world was a wearisome place, laden with pain and grief. Even the best sort of life was permeated with anxiety and suffering, and would ultimately end at the charnel ground. Sooner or later, one would realize that complete freedom from samsara was really the only thing worth seeking. The Hindus call this moksha, absolute and unconditional liberation. The Buddha called it nibbana, or nirvana, the Sanskrit term more familiar to Westerners. Attaining release from samsara could not be accomplished merely by generating good karma. Even if one were the finest person possible, performing only good deeds, it would not be sufficient to break free from samsara's everlasting grind. Positive karmic acts might temporarily take one to the apex of the chain of being, but eventually one's store of good karma would be depleted, and one would at last face another death and rebirth. As long as one produced karma of any kind, good or bad, one was bound to the wheel of samsara. Seeking a favorable rebirth could thus only be a short-term goal. In the long run, rebirth itself would have to be brought to an end. As this new understanding of human nature and destiny gained wide acceptance throughout northern India, it provoked a vast movement of individuals who decided to forsake their connections with the world to seek final liberation from samsara. They gave up their homes and possessions, their families and jobs, because they considered nothing as important as moksha. Men and many women of all ages and castes joined this movement, but persons from the middle castes were especially drawn to it. They were called samanas, or strivers, to indicate their dedication to practicing religious austerities in pursuit of emancipation from rebirth. The samanas were a common sight in the emerging villages and towns of the Gangetic Plain, and ordinary people often sought their advice and teachings. These samanas often experimented with an immense array of disciplines and doctrines to seek a way to their goal. Many wandered about northern India searching out new teachers and new spiritual techniques. Some isolated themselves in caves or deep within the forest, and they all lived in self-imposed poverty, frequently owning only a bowl for begging food, Some had even renounced clothing. Although the individuals in this movement varied greatly in their chosen paths and disciplines, they were united by a single ambition: to find relief from the anguish of samsara. They were so dedicated to this cause that they were willing to give up the pleasures and comforts of the world to achieve it. And even more, they believed renouncing the world was essential to that purpose. Some of these ascetics declared that they had indeed discovered the path leading away from samsara. Although we have no record of many teachings, we know a considerable amount about a few of them. The most prominent among the early teachings was offered by the Upanishads, that wonderful anthology from this age in Indian history, which later became one of the sacred scriptures of Hinduism. A brief exploration of this perspective will be helpful as we turn to examine the teachings of the Buddha. Because of the prominence of the Upanishadic philosophy, many of the Buddha's teachings were developed in direct response to this perspective. The Upanishads was a fairly diverse collection of philosophical treatises and parables written over a period of several centuries. But most of the writings it contained concerned three fundamental matters: the nature of the self or soul, the nature of ultimate reality, and the relationship between them. The Upanishads offered several points of view on each of these issues, but it is possible to describe a consensus perspective. We'll begin with the soul. The concept of atman, or soul, had been a part of the Aryans' religion before they had migrated into India. But in the Vedic tradition, this ancient concept was not clearly defined or well developed. There seemed to be little agreement about where the soul came from, where it went upon death, or what exactly it was. At most, the Vedas understood the soul as a vague entity that animates life and keeps the body from being a mere corpse. By the age of the Samanas, though, a more definite idea about the soul had come into view. According to this perspective, the soul was an eternal entity residing in, but separate from the body. The authors of the Upanishads asserted that the soul was not created and never came into being at a particular time. It simply always has been. Furthermore, since it was not subject to birth, it could never die. The soul was immortal beyond birth and death. While it is true that the soul transmigrated, it was only the body that was born and died. The soul, which the Upanishads identified as the true self, the real self underlying all appearances, was imperceptible, beyond description, and distinguished not only from the body, but from the mind as well. Now, just as sages of the Upanishads sought to comprehend the nature of the soul, they also tried to grasp the ultimate reality, which they called Brahman. Again, the authors did not wholly agree about Brahman, but certain themes recurred, and these motifs had a profound influence on subsequent Hinduism. Among the most prevalent was the idea that Brahman was a single indivisible reality that could not be adequately explained or comprehended through ordinary means. Although Brahman was the deepest reality underlying all things, it was unavailable to the five senses. It encompassed the whole universe and yet transcended it. It embraced both good and evil and yet was beyond them. Later Hindu thinkers would suggest that although Brahman was formless, it could be partially known through the images of the many gods and goddesses of the Hindu pantheon. Brahman itself transcended all the gods and yet empowered them. In their search for overcoming samsara, many Indian ascetics came to a startling conclusion that led them to believe that their quest of moksha might indeed have come to an end. In the later Upanishads, the sages expressed their conviction that the soul and the ultimate reality known as Brahman were in fact identical, one and the same. The Samanas did not simply declare that the soul was a part of Brahman. Brahman, after all, was indivisible. Rather, they suggested that Atman and Brahman were two names for the same reality. The true self was ultimate reality. Brahman, Atman, was the only reality there was. The Samanas now understood the source of human anguish on the wheel of samsara as a consequence of ignorance, a complete misunderstanding about the true nature of the self and reality. The failure to apprehend reality correctly encouraged the belief that the soul is a separate entity, separate from Brahman, separate from the rest of reality. This delusion is what caused persons to act in a self-obsessed manner, leading to the production of the karma that chained one to samsara. Believing oneself to be an entity separate from all else bred the desire and hatred that led to the anguish of samsara and ultimately caused the fear of death. The only way out of this morass was to realize completely the identity of the soul and the deepest reality. That realization came only at the end of a long road of intense spiritual discipline. Here, as concisely as I am able to set forth, were the essential features of the intellectual, religious world into which Siddhartha Gautama was born. I've not been able to present all the many subtleties and diverse viewpoints comprising this world, but this broad sketch will suffice to portray the social and religious environment of his life. He lived at a time of spiritual and religious questioning, when traditions were being reevaluated and basic questions of existence, what are we deep down? Where do we come from? Where are we going? What is the fundamental character of reality? We're receiving exhilarating new answers. The man called the Buddha will have his distinct voice to add to this conversation.